Suzanne takes you down to her place near the river.
When we bring people round the fire and we hold space for them to open up and truly connect, what happens is something emerges. You can see it in the field. People can feel it. It's an embodied experience. And what is shared, what people are speaking is they're coming from a different voice. They're coming from their deeper, truer nature, and they're tapping in to nature's wisdom. And we're allowing ourselves to be instruments of a deeper wisdom that then sings through us. And that's really, I believe, what we're here to do as human beings, as Homo sapiens, wise beings, is open up to the sentience of life that wishes to be heard and wishes us to be almost like the mouthpiece or the conscious act of this bursting forth of wisdom.
That was Giles Hutchins, our guest for today's podcast.
And you want to travel with her, and you want to travel blind, and you know that she will trust you.
Welcome to the Sue Speaks podcast, searching for unity in everything. I'm your host, Suzanne Taylor. How can we turn the world around? Can we turn this world around? That's what I talk to my thought-shaping guests about. In fact, everything I've done has been in pursuit of the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, buoyed up by that famous quote by Margaret Mead, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Giles Hutchins is the first guest I've had who I don't know. But when our similar visions drew us together, I got excited about doing something different with this podcast, where rather than it be introductory about Giles, I'd like it to be creative with him. There's so much material out there about what's wrong and what needs to change. But what I don't readily find are conversations about getting us to where we need to be. So I invited Giles to think about this prompt. If I ran the world, something or things I would do, blank, blank, blank. But first, I'll give you a little intro to Giles, who is an influencer from England who writes and speaks and advises and coaches and runs projects and enterprises to change the way businesses operate in a regenerative rather than an exploitive way, which is just one way to characterize the cusp we're on, where we can continue to do business as usual. Now, it would take too long to tell you about the breadth and the depth of what Giles writes about and talks about and models so compellingly, but you can find all that, including a TED Talk that I can't recommend highly enough, on our Sue Speaks podcast page for Giles. So Giles, let's get to it to fix the world. Would you agree with me that an agreement about the world we want would be first on the agenda, where we have to know where we're headed in order to get there? And if you ran the world, would you have ideas about how to bring that new understanding about, or would you start somewhere else?
Yes, I think I can agree with you there, Suzanne. It's lovely to be here with you, speaking across the airwaves from England. Yes, I think we are desperately in need for a new vision of what humanity can bring and the role it can play and the purpose it has on this planet in these quite challenging times. And a key aspect for me, I feel, or perhaps the key aspect, would be transforming education. Transforming what we actually mean by education, and then the intent and purpose of education. The ancient Greeks used to refer to education, or edusia, as bringing forth what is within us, bringing forth. So that allowing the individual and the collective bringing forth, I believe, is what really needs to stimulate the intent of education for all ages. So it becomes transformative. As you say, we kind of need to understand the vision. We kind of also need to understand where we've come from, what we're working with, and therefore what are we bringing forth into. I mean, the short response is there is really good news. And the really good news is that we need do nothing more nor nothing less than actually open up to how life really is, open up to more of our humanity. And how nature works. But that is a short response. The deeper response is that there is a story, a mythos, if you like, that we have got caught up in. And that mythos, that story is changing. It's going through a change on our watch. And so the mythos is changing, but also the logos that feeds from that mythos is going through a change. So we need to, in our education, both be aware of the mythos that's changing and the logos that's changing. Both are important as each other, a bit like the feminine and the masculine. And, you know, if I may quote from the French writer Anton Saint-Exupéry, he says that if you want to build a ship, don't assign people tasks or break them up into teams. Instead, teach them to long for the immensity of the sea. And what we're doing is we are helping people. We are assigning, we are involved too much in the to-do list, where actually we need to allow education to bring forth this immensity of the sea. We have essentially fallen out of love with life, and we need to reenact, re-enable, re-enliven that capacity to sense into the immensity of the sea. So that's our shift in mythos, if you like, a shift from a story of separation that we've got deeply caught up in, which infects the way that we think about nature, the way we think about business and politics and medicine and education, and shift that story into a story of regeneration, reconnection. And in so doing, actually open us up to that immensity of the sea, so that we fall back in love with how life really is and our humanity in that.
Oh, that is so beautiful. I really, now how can we emblazon that in some delivery that gets sent to everyone?
So it's very easy to apply the consciousness of yesterday, which is top down, mechanistic, overly masculine, overly outer focused, and apply that to our education system. And actually what we need to be doing is just allowing people to become more alive. So I work specifically at the leadership level. I do that for a number of reasons. So I work mainly with adults and around adult developmental psychology and leadership development. But the simple act of, you know, helping leaders sense into how they become better leaders by connecting them with the natural world and connecting with their deeper nature, enables them to shift. You know, they have a visceral, embodied, experiential shift when they're with me in nature that they remember, that they can call upon, that they can't forget because it touches parts that other mechanistic thinking just doesn't do. And they know in their hearts that it's right. And they sense that. And I think that's what we need to bring more of in. Whether it be, you know, I've worked with a headmaster at primary school where he engages with learning from living systems and nature at the primary school level, or whether it be the work I do with leaders, there are powerful ways that we can just allow life itself to interrupt our programming of this mechanistic story of separation, so that we just notice, even if for brief moments, we allow that crack of light in so that we can see beyond the current state of play into something deeper.
I really like how you work with root cause rather than fixing this and that so that we're better at, you know, whatever, but rather get to what's underneath it all and how we think in a very basic way about whether we're going to be exploitive people using the world or whether we're going to be of the world expressing into it. And also just another reaction I had to you talking about children. I mean, we're here in the States. I don't know if you have them in England, but there are programs for preschool children and kindergarten children to teach kindness. And I'm big on kindness. I'm big on that. If kindness pervaded the world, we'd be in a different world. How to bring that about is always on my agenda. So hopping over, we've kind of segued from the children to the leadership with the adults, which is what you're so good at. So if you ran the world, so now you're going to teach the children differently. Next.
I think back to this shifting worldview where we see how life is. So there's something, this educating isn't just a sort of in-class teaching. We don't have to go out and do vision quests on a mountaintop or sit in woods with it raining. You know, just sitting around the campfire allows us to notice our masks and our restrictions and allows us to open up. And within a couple of hours, with a group of adults round the fire, we can create the environment that enables people to start embodying that kindness that you talk about. The quality of empathy that we naturally have as human beings starts to become more embodied with simple practices. So in terms of, what else, I think there's something about, let's inform, whether you call it education or not, but through media, through information, let's start sharing what we now know. And we've known since the 20th century, and ancient wisdom traditions have known for millennia, how interconnected life is, how everything is interrelating on this system called Gaia or Earth, and that everything is participating in a field of consciousness. We also know that. We've known that brilliant minds like Max Planck and Einstein and David Bohm, we should be allowing that information to come out because it informs us. It allows us to shift beyond this sort of getting caught up in self-preservation or self-maximization at the expense of other, where we see the whole process of evolution as one of selfish ascendancy, to actually realizing that life is participatory. And that shifts then how we attend to life. And so then practices come. Again, you could call it education if you want, or just simple practices that enliven us, that enable our energy to be cultivated, that enable us to open up and become freer, more expansive, more in flow, more happy. So rather than the pursuit of some external happiness out there, the old dream through essentially ego titillation and false whims that distract us from ourselves, we actually create an environment that allows us to go on that journey of deeper self-discovery through a more collective approach, a more participatory approach. So it's the individual within the collective. It's the collective celebrating the individual, that diversity and unity and unity and diversity that we need to start playing with. So I think that's important. That's why I'd start with education, because it creates the environment that allows us to see this rich tapestry of life so that we know how to behave within it.
What would you do to move everybody into this awareness? How would we do that?
Well, I think if we looked at, say, education, if we looked at the past, then it'd be very powerful to explain the mythos that has informed us today, to explain what happened, 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens coming out of Africa, and then this long stretch of time from 100,000 to 10,000 years, where until the Neolithic agricultural revolution, and then from 10,000 years to 5,000 years, these waves of invasions that actually changed how we were. And that for a vast portion of our human history, 95% of our time, as far as we can tell from the information that we can find anthropologically, we lived through egalitarian, masculine, feminine, non-violent ways. And that is inherent within us. And we were highly attuned to nature. We were in right relation with planet. Now, we're lucky to have fragments of shamanic cultures still left today that still emulate that we can learn from. But then what happened due to a change in culture, a change in climate, what some people have called an ego explosion, a psychological shift within us, is things changed. Certainly, if we look at Europe, we had, things like the Minoan culture in Crete really is the last frontier of that kind of egalitarian culture, holding on about 1,000 years ago. But otherwise, everything else starting to drift into what we call this story of separation. And then that, there were vestiges of that connection, that deep sense of connection with life, with each other, with the world around us, a sense of sacredness for life, all the way through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. But really from the age of reason, the scientific revolution, which is only 500 years ago, so a much shorter period of time, quite recent, 300 or 400 years ago, really we started having this rise of a mechanistic, control-based approach that saw only the fragments of life and focused in on the parts and undermined the interrelation of life. So it's important to have that context first and foremost, Because otherwise, what happens when you speak to children, you speak to adults, you speak to business leaders, you go, well, that's just the way life is. I'm sorry, it's a dog-eat-dog world. That's just the way business is. And no, it hasn't been like that. And even then, over the last few decades, since the Second World War, looking at examples of businesses, many of them Quaker-led or faith-led, and all sorts of social entrepreneurs that have actually tried business ventures that actually enhance the value of society and the environment and all stakeholders. And then look at what's happening today on our watch, this shift from, what has become largely extenuated sense of separateness and mechanistic thinking, which is now undermining the vitality of businesses themselves, of leaders, highly stressed in a volatile environment, but also, of course, the whole fabric of life on Earth and society. And now what we find in this precipice, if you like, is, again, examples of people starting to look at the breakthrough elements of the breakdown and so whether it be, for instance, if we look at US CEOs, 191 of the largest organizations in North America come together through the CEO Roundtable. 2 decades ago, 191 of them agreed clearly that the primary purpose of the organization was to maximize shareholder returns. That was the purpose of the corporation. 2 decades later, just a few years ago, and we're talking 20 years shift, they now agree across the board that actually it's not that. It's to enhance stakeholder value that includes society and the environment, of which shareholder value is derived. And it's not just those leaders of big corporations. As you well know, it's B Corps, it's social innovation, it's the blessed unrest that Paul Hawken talks about. There's a whole wave of change that is happening. So all of that is informing the field that is happening today. And that's important to inform that. Then we can then look at, well, what is the way of thinking? What is the logic? What are the approaches that we can then apply to our organizations, to our social systems, to our political structures, to our ways of medicine and transportation that actually enhance it? So we have to come from that basis. Otherwise, and this often happens in the climate emergency, in social change movements and so forth, we run the risk of applying a very reductive mindset, the very mindset that got us caught up in this problem in the first place, to our well-intended solutions.
Well, this was a wonderful history lesson, a little romp through 2,000 years. I would add to that the idea that agriculture made a big change, where from hunter-gatherer, when we were so plugged into nature, when all of a sudden agriculture came along, we had surplus and a possession and, our argument over who had more and all of that sort of thing. I know that was one of the big changes that took us out of our connection to nature in that very primal way. One of the things I really like very much is Anne Baring's work. I'm sure you know her because that's your world over there in England, about how we put God outside ourselves, the sun god. So we went from lunar to solar, where now we were supplicant to God. We were not God ourselves anymore, not of nature anymore. That was a huge change that has, culminated now. And I think of it as culminated, and I imagine, I'm sure you do too, where we've hit the wall. And we can't do it anymore. We live on a finite planet and we can't have endless growth. It won't work that way. And we see, the climate devastation, the challenges to the survival of humanity. Oh my gosh, we've never been that able to destroy ourselves. We're so good technologically that now we can destroy the whole planet. But for many different, challenges, it's so urgent that we change our perspective, where we're not dog eat dog, but we are a cooperative world. And I know you and I are so, aligned. So now let's go back again, though, to my query. If you were, this is the intelligence of the world. Now, if you were running it, how would you be sure that people got this education, this understanding?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to give this sort of masterpiece picture, if you like, which any good masterpiece has, which is the background, the middle ground, and the foreground. So we have context, because it's very easy for us. We have this desire to sort of kick straight in with a to-do list. So I'm trying to give the backdrop which is the context. And I'm glad you mentioned Anne Baring. What a lovely soul. We're friends, Anne and I love her work. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. And she's very good at, part of that whole story and how we need to understand that story so that we find our right place in the now. So that's the backdrop, the mythos, if you like. And then there's the middle ground, which is the practicalities almost, or the values and the ethics that we live by. And I love the image of the iceberg, where we got the tip of the iceberg on the top, which is our outer sense of behaviors and decision making and so forth in business and politics and so on. But actually it's what lies underneath in the bigger bit of the iceberg, which are our values, which then attend to our beliefs and our underlying worldview. And as Donella Meadows said, the systems thinker, it's that going into the worldview where we make the most leverage around system change. And so that's why I talk about logos. I talk about the logic of life in the book that myself and Laura Storm have written, Regenerative Leadership. We explore what the logic of life is and how we can apply living systems logic and how life works and has been for 3.8 billion years, and apply that learning to our organization development, to our leadership development, and also to our system structures, whether it be cities, whether it be placemaking in neighborhoods, or whether it be governments and institutions. And so a lot of the work we do at the moment is in that. So we're working with an organization, for instance, at the moment, a very sustainable organization, and we're looking through an education process again, taking all their staff, their leaders and so forth through a process where they fully understand that their organization is a living system, and that living system is interrelational, and that living system is immersed within a field of stakeholders, society, the environment, and everything that they're doing is constantly participating in that field. So it comes with a humbling sense of responsibility, but it also comes with the capacity to open us up to more of life and realize that each day at work is a developmental journey that we take responsibility in, depending on how conscious we're being. So that's the middle ground, which is the logos, if you like, the logic of life, learning to be in right relation with life. And then there's the foreground, the immediacy, which is what's going on for most people, which is our daily practices. How do we bring in energy cultivation? How do we recognize holistic health? How do we see that our interactions, our quality of listening and our quality of speaking and being present and coherent are all part of becoming more human, becoming more aware, becoming more in flow with this song of life, if you like, that is singing through us. And so there's lots of practices at the backdrop, the middle ground and the foreground, but that's just a sort of taste of the context that we need to hold this in. And then we can dive into the practicalities of then, well, how do we help people go through transformation, which is essentially an educational based process?
How would we deliver this to everyone? I mean, this should be required.
I think it's, again, let's always keep ourselves mindful of the power of yesterday's logic, or not just yesterday's logic, but the mechanistic aspect within us. Yeah, we have left brain hemispheres, it's part of us, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need that focused way of doing, but let's notice it and balance it with the feminine, with the relational and the intuitive, because it's very easy for us to get carried away, as I'm sure we all have as activists through our life, and get passionate. Before we know it, we're pushing things on people, or we're looking to implement laws and regulations that actually then just warp. They're not followed through by people who truly get it. So that just becomes another way of making money or controlling or so forth. So we've got to be careful, because it's an easy tendency to say, right, okay, let's sort of instill something from the top down. If I was to be that leader, that benign leader, then I would be trying to cultivate the conditions in culture that allow this to emerge from within. And I would like to quote Jesus, if I may, who says that if we bring forth what is within us will save us. If we don't bring forth what is within us will destroy us. And what we're seeing in this time is how, by not allowing what is within us, the unconscious psyche that Anne Baring and others talk about, coming through and alchemizing into our daily life through practice, through education, through sharing and dialogue, then actually it gets stifled, it gets suppressed, and we see it coming out in odd ways, whether that be Trumpism or bizarre behaviors or racism and so forth. And so what we've got to do is allow this to be alchemized. If we start to project onto other people, or project what's right and wrong, or create rules for other people, then we start to create shadows. And we've got to be aware of that. So we've got to be very conscious when we go into any path of education that we're truly walking the path through that narrow needle's eye, if you like, of truth and freedom and love and wisdom.
What you're speaking about to me is so fundamental, and yet it isn't so fundamental when, we're not hearing it from everywhere. We're hearing it from a few places. The places we're hearing it from are very coherent. Like, you make perfect sense to me. For instance, if I ran the world, everybody would be in a circle of trust. We used to think about mastermind groups. I remember we used to talk about that sort of thing. That same kind of thing, help each other. Such a simple thing,
I totally agree with you. I love circles of trust. I love Parker J. Palmer's work as well, which is and we practice way of counsel here in the Woodlands, where we bring leaders together. I've tried to bring in circles of trust within business schools, where senior leaders come together and you buffer up against, well, what's the objective? What's the outcome? And yet I'm getting there. I now run programs of transformation in a number of the leading business schools here in the UK and internationally. So we are getting there, where I run circles of trust. And you're right. I mean, a lot of this is about deep listening, is about being in presence, it's about speaking from the heart and allowing, through the power of generative dialogue, for something else to emerge between us. And I think there's some very, if I might answer directly to your question around how do we operationalize this? Well, when I was younger, the wheels came off the road for me. I always had a deep sense of connection with nature, but it wasn't until my teenage years, and when I was 15, that I actually realized what was going on in the world. I actually thought that I was, just part of civilization, and I was learning through the educational system to get a job and help service this civilization. And I quite quickly realized that it wasn't civilized at all. When I realized about animals being skinned alive, tested on, factory farming, child labor, so forth, all of this thing, the wheels came off the road for me. And I vowed to go into business to find out what the strategy was for business, because I could see how being an activist actually sometimes can create a buffering. You're pushing against people. You're sort of trying to persuade them of something that one needs to go in and change from within. So that's what I've tried to do, and why I've been a head of practice at KPMG. I've worked with CEOs throughout the world and head of sustainability for a multinational, and now coach CEOs. I'm accepted by the system, and yet what I'm doing is I'm changing their mindset. And I believe changing at that leadership level in big organizations, private sector, third sector, government, is the way forward to help leverage change. Because otherwise, people in schools, kids, teachers all say, yeah, but we have to help people get a job. And this is all well and good and it's nice, but, and it all comes down to this economy, stupid, or it comes down to earning money. So until we go right into the system, which is where business is essentially, and go right in there and start actually allowing that circle of trust, allowing that love to come through the system, that interconnectedness to come in, then we're always caught up in yesterday's logic. So that's what I'm doing, going right in that system and allowing that humanity to come through. And the good news is the conditions that we've created through this story of separation are the very conditions that are helping wake us up, because we're up against it now. We're going into the car crash. We're actually experiencing the breakdown. And so there are powerful forces that are pushing us and that are pulling us out into breakthrough. And it reminds me of the ancient shamanic journey, again, as if the meta myth, the shaman knew this all along, of departure, separation, and return. And it feels like we've had this nadir of separation. We've learned what we needed to from this capacity of separating from our own mother, our own life. And now we're returning home. And so what I try to do with leaders is focus on the positives about those capacities of how returning home helps your organization become more agile, become more future fit, become more purposeful. It helps people want to work for you. And at the same token, your business then begins to serve real value for society and the environment. Because most business people, they're not evil. They wish to do the right thing. They're just caught up in the wrong logic.
That is so much, the right story. Do you think there would be some merit, again, if you ran the world? What about if you people were in council, the ones who think most deeply and in most aligned way, the way you are thinking? I mean, that's what I would do. If I ran the world, I'd put you all in touch with one another, just, because you're the ones who are the wisest about this way of being that we need to move into. Maybe I can use this podcast as a uniter. Let's get on a Zoom call together and just see what merit there is in people who are thinking so similarly about these vital things to put our heads together. I really, that seems very intriguing to me to be doing. I'm cooking an idea here.
Yeah. Creating circles of trust around this space would be hugely important. And one thing, just to finish on the educational theme and recognizing that, again, we're bringing forth something. And again, the mechanistic mindset naturally assumes that we're bringing forth something inside our own body, or inside our own genes, inside our own embedded intelligence. But actually, we're bringing forth something from life itself in part of the creative act of evolution. And I see this happening in practice through circles of trust. When we bring people around the fire and we hold space for them to open up and truly connect, what happens is something emerges. You can see it in the field. People can feel it. It's an embodied experience. And what is shared, what people are speaking is they're coming from a different voice. They're coming from their deeper, truer nature, and they're tapping in to nature's wisdom. And we're allowing ourselves to be instruments of a deeper wisdom that then sings through us. And that's really, I believe, what we're here to do as human beings, as Homo sapiens, wise beings, is open up to the sentience of life that wishes to be heard and wishes us to be almost like the mouthpiece or the conscious act of this bursting forth of wisdom.
Well, all the kinds of historical whatever awarenesses, you really can make a case for the fact that we are inherently good and that all the ways that we would move to are in a way riding the horse in the direction it's going, which is always a good idea. And the direction is that humanity has this potential to really be godlike, if you will. And I don't mean that in any, external God over, but that we're all of the stardust, we're from the Big Bang, we're still it. And we've taken this circuitous course, but that's the way life develops. You go the wrong way, then you adjust, and the shift place we're on is comparable to when we went from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. It's just that important to get us off this self-centered path we're on to where we're in a world of mutuality. And it's life or death now.
I would agree. I think it is as pivotal as that, except the time zone, the pace of change is different, because literally what we've seen just in the last 30 years is more social change or psychological change that we've seen in the last 3,000 years. So it's the pace of change. And again, how can we allow ourselves through education, through creating the right environment around the mythos and the logos, to do exactly what you were speaking of then, to believe in ourselves, to believe in our natural capacity as human beings, and to open up to that and to unlock our innate supernature. That's the role of education, to bring us forth, not to enslave us and to twist us down economic pathways that take us away from who we truly are, but to actually liberate us. And that is a positive story. And it's a story that I believe cuts beyond left and right in politics, that goes into a new space of celebrating the individuality of us within the communality of us. Because what makes us truly human is our capacity to love and our capacity to be wise. Now let's start sensing that. Let's, as Anton says, actually create the immensity of the sea so that we start to love that immensity within us, and that galvanizes us and takes us through this time of breakdown and breakthrough.
You paid attention to this idea of business. You were very intrigued by it, but how did you get to where you are, where you're so knowledgeable? I mean, knowledgeable about not only the story, the trajectory we're all on from as us human beings become who we can be, but also all of that material for how to move consciousness, how to change people's perspective, how to open them up, how to tune them in to their natural beingness. Where did you come to all that? How'd you get all that?
Well, a mixture of sort of standing on the shoulders of many giants, many great thinkers before me, studying ancient wisdom traditions. I do what Joseph Campbell calls following your bliss. So I read books, and then when I sense it and I love it, I follow the path of what's going on. But also it's mixed in with my own inner guidance system. So even when I remember when I was a child, I remember having arguments with my parents when we used to watch nature programs, when I just refused to agree that the way that the geese find their way home or the way that the salmon go up the river was to do with some sort of just what was called instinct. It was just something to be thrown away as, well, that's just how it happens. It's just instinct. It's something embedded in the gene. I innately knew that there was something going on. And so when you then hear things later on in life, whether it be morphogenetics or field theory, your heart resonates with it. So it's not that you're reading stuff. What's happening is, and I think we all do this, is that you're resonating with certain stuff. So again, back to education. How can we allow ourselves the capacity to learn to resonate? Otherwise, we're just being spoon-fed. That's really what's happening, is we're participating with all of this knowledge and wisdom around us, some of which is passed down through ancient wisdom traditions, some of which is more contemporary, but actually it's all in the field. It's all there, and we can sense it through our own soul. So we need to learn to be able to resonate with that. So we go, that's true. That's true for me, and I agree with that. Now let me follow that path.
I'm thinking to education where, okay, we need to get those teachers tuned in so they can get the kids tuned in. Well, that would be moving into the university, the education system that are educating the teachers. Are there courses, or do the teachers learn this sort of thing? And if not, that would be, I would think, a leverage place, to make sure that all of the teaching colleges and universities were dealing, with this kind of material. Yes, no?
Yeah, except at the moment, there's no demand for it. So people are going into it. There's places like Schumacher College and Findhorn and many others. I just talk about the places in the UK and Help the Eden Project, where we taught the nature of leadership. There's lots of places, more and more, that are doing that. What I'm noticing in my specific field, and there's a reason why I consciously chose this field because of its effect, its catalytic effect on other fields in business, is we're starting to get there now. So we're starting to talk about how do we learn from living systems? How do we allow the organization to be a living system, to be a complex adaptive system? What does that mean for leadership? How do we move more into servant leadership, into dialogue, into authenticity? All of that purpose is starting to come into mainstream. And so again, I put there that I'm not too worried about our capacity to operationalize. Let's be honest, we've operationalized everything. We're pretty good at doing the operational stuff. We've managed to operationalize ourselves into a massive car crash. Yeah. And we're really good at it. So to operational ourselves into this, which is far more alluring and far more real, I don't think will be the problem. We've got that capacity. I think the problem is, or the challenge is shifting that mythos, shifting that so that we teach people to long for the immensity of the sea. Then, once we've taught people to long for the immensity of the sea, we start breaking people up into tasks and assigning them to chop wood and assigning them to do things. And that's where that logos, that ability to understand the logic of life, whether it be biomimicry or biophilic design or developmental cultures or authentic leadership, all of those tools then start coming into the mainstream. But let's not forget that importance of teaching people to long for the immensity of the sea. Now, to do that in the midst of a pandemic, COVID, a global pandemic around mental health issues, around volatility in the stock market, around business leaders that are into high beta stress, that's the real challenge of today. And yet I feel that situation we're in, I don't see it as, oh my gosh, it's too hard. I see it as the supreme moment, what the Greeks called kairos, the supreme moment in our human history. If not now, then when? This is the perfect moment for us to be able to shift, I believe.
Oh, I'm right with you on that. By the way, if I ran the world, I would make everybody read what is my basic source of the master intelligence, which is Brian Swim's book, The Universe is a Green Dragon. Is this a book you are familiar with? Well, to me, it is so evocative of our privilege of being human beings, that it's all in our hands now. We've taken over from evolution. And you come out of that book, and also Brian himself, who's such an inspirational person, and also another person I did a podcast with. But you come out of that book so imbued with the privilege it is to be human, and then the obligation, to really help the world.
I think in today's world, where we talk about the climate emergency, we're now starting to talk about, obviously, the mental health issues that are going on, which have been for some time. We talk about all the stress that's going on in the systems, in the human systems, in the ecological systems, and social systems. And I feel there's one thing that has yet to join the party. And when it does, and it's coming, it will change the nature of the party. And you're on the cusp of that when we're talking about the privilege of what it means to be truly human. And it's this opening up, this expanding concept of what it actually means to be human, to help us become what it truly means to be human. And that is our capacity to engage with the enchantment and the sacredness of life, where we open up to the spirit within and all around us. Now, that has yet to truly land. When I talk about it, and I've been talking about it for many years, I often get poo-pooed or sidelined from discussions, whether it be in the sustainability arena or the leadership arena, because you can get positioned as, oh, he's got some strange ideas. But I think the time is now coming for that. And that actually the great work that people like Brian Swim and Anne Baring and Irvin Laszlo and people like this have done is now setting the field for this, because people are longing for the immensity of the sea. And of course, the sea is the oceanic presence that we're all immersed within.
Oh, that is so beautiful. We should stop on being beautiful. I could talk to you forever, I mean, seriously.
I think we're all finding this time challenging, and yet there is a lot of energy flowing in the system. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of shifts going on. And if we can allow ourselves to keep ourselves centered, to remind ourselves that our deeper intent is to connect truly with the center of the earth and to connect and open up to the universal energy, then we are instruments. And then it becomes a privilege to be human, because it's so easy to get caught up in all the noise today. So yes, it's been a bit like walking a dark tunnel, and it's been quite lonely. And yet when I look back on my life and I look at all the things that have happened, I can see that songline coming through, and something is shifting. Something is in the air. For that, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm with you. This is such a really critical time and in a way exciting time, even though it's a depressing time. Why don't we go to those two questions that I asked you
Yep.
of what is your sense of mission that you have? And also, do you have a one-line message for the world?
So my mission is to help humanity reconnect with nature's wisdom, and in particular by activating the logic of life for leaders. That's my mission. And my one line to the world is what is within us is within everything. And let's learn to open our eyes, our ears, and our body mind to the song lines and the synchronicities of life, so that we learn to read the book of life, to co-create and participate with the book of life, and in so doing, step into what it means to be truly human.
I'm so glad I asked you that in advance so that you could write out such a really beautiful, beautiful way to end this podcast. So, Giles, would you marry? No, you're not going to marry me, but that I wouldn't mind. That'd be okay. So I hope someday we can, meet in person, get across the pond. I spent a lot of time in England shooting this crop circle movie, which I thought might change the world if we were being visited, which the evidence seemed to point to. So that didn't quite work. I didn't quite get the world turned around on this one, but maybe this podcast will do it. Anyway, it is such a pleasure to talk to you, Giles. Now that we've got Zoom, I'm cooking already. I'm thinking we came up with something. Why don't I put you all together and see if I can get a round table going of us people who think like you think. So I'm excited now. Onward. So thanks a million, Giles. Stay tuned.
Keep in touch. Let's stay connected.
We will.
Now Suzanne takes your hand and she leads you to the river.
So, dear listeners, thank you for tuning into my Sue Speaks podcast. Do subscribe so you don't miss any episodes, and visit SueSpeaksPodcast.com for notes on what we covered in this episode and for additional information about my guest. Also, I'd love to engage with you there to hear your opinions. How did you feel about what you heard? Did you learn anything, or were you inspired to act in any new way? Or do you have something to add that would let us know what you know? This is a go-to place for people to grab cups of consciousness and fire away.
And you want to travel with her, and you want to travel blind, and you know you can trust her, for she's touched your perfect body.